All right, it is 3:15, so we will get started. Thank you all for joining us. Two quick housekeeping notes. We are recording this session, and we do ask that you mute your line. If you're on a phone, you can press *6 and mute your line. If you're on the screen, you should be muted already. If you have questions for the question and answer, please type them in the chat box at any time, and we'll go over those at the end of the presentation. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Curbside Management, Understanding Disruption and Demand-Based Responses.
Awesome, thanks, Kim. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session. Kim, would you be able to queue up that the first poll question for everyone?
Absolutely, there you go.
Awesome. Thanks. We'll let that question run and have you all answer it, and then we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves and get started. All right. Looks like a lot of people have answered. Should we, Kim, would you like me to go ahead and end the polling, or do you? Perfect.
That for you.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we're, as Kim said, we're talking about curbside management today, so we wanted to get started with this question, just thinking about what you all think we need to be doing to optimize curbside supply. And it looks like overwhelmingly everyone thinks that we need to decrease car parking, which is really interesting to hear. That is something we will definitely be talking about a little bit later. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share results and get started so we can introduce ourselves, and then we can get going with the presentation. There we go. As I've mentioned, I'm Meera Raja. I'm really excited to be here leading this panel talking about curbside management and how we can use activity and demand data to think a little bit about how to manage the curb. I'm the Senior Manager of Solution Design and Program Development here at City Tech Collaborative. City Tech Collaborative is an urban solutions accelerator based out of Chicago, and we're really interested in thinking about these complex urban challenges and bringing solutions to them that no one entity or no one organization can solve by themselves. So we like to work in projects like this, like Curbside, and bring different groups together, like you're going to see here through Teralytics, Here Technology, Stantec, and think about, collaboratively think about how to solve some of these problems. With that, I will introduce Ann Lin. She's a product owner at Teralytics. Ann, if you could tell us a little bit about Teralytics. And a question I have for you is, what do you think is the most important reason is to flex the curb?
Okay, thanks, Meera. So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Ann. I'm a product owner at Teralytics. And here I help to manage the development of some of our platforms and products. So Teralytics, we're headquartered in Zurich, but we operate in countries across Europe, Asia, and of course in the United States as well. At Teralytics, our mission is really to transform how people's journeys are planned for, operated, and accounted for. So what we want to do is help transit planners, transport operators, pretty much everyone in this kind of whole transportation ecosystem we've developed to drive change and maybe create more equitable transit systems, reach our environmental and service goals. And we try to help these people by delivering insights into people's journeys by processing signal data from telco networks. And we'll go into a bit about that later. And kind of to answer Meera's question of could you repeat the question?
Yeah, what do you think is the most important reason for us to flex our curbs?
So I mean, kind of maybe not a surprise to everyone here, curb is really a resource that we're not really allowing to work for us right now, and how the curb is used has changed, how it's managed has not, but also it'll continue to change as time goes on. And I think that's why we have decided to work with City Tech and our other partners here, because We, like many of you, see so much potential to make the curb work for us, but it can be hard to know where to start, how and why. And that's why we can come together to develop a solution that will help us make decisions on how to do that, maybe now, but also in the future as well as things change.
Awesome. Thanks, Anne, for the intro. Gerhard Boicius, he's a global product manager of parking at Here Technology. Gerhard, if you could, same sort of thing, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about Here Technologies and what you think is the most important reason to flex the curb.
Sure, absolutely. So Gerhard Boicius, I'm with Here Technologies. I'm based in Seattle, and I've been managing our parking product for a year and a half now. And our focus has always been connecting on-street and off-street parking. And for the folks who are not familiar with Here Technologies, our HQ in North America is in Chicago. That's why Chicago is near and dear for us to understand traffic situation, parking situation, curbside, which is pretty nascent for us overall. But parking is something that's really very interesting, and it's been part of our roadmap for many years now. And we have many automotive OEMs as our customers. So that's our primary customer base, where, for example, we're mapping about 200 plus countries already, have those available. We have 4 out of 5 cars are using our maps currently. So that's why we're always interested in exploring new bleeding edge relevant use cases that are touching upon parking and making like the everyday life in big congested areas, like, for example, Chicago, metro areas like Chicago, to understand better how we can improve the quality of life there. And I think that's also the answer to the question. For me, I want to answer by saying that understanding activity at the curb will improve the quality of life for everyone in these major metro areas that, as we all know, are going to just become more and more congested as time comes.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks, Gerhard. Jason, could you round out the introductions? Jason Schrieber is a senior principal of the Urban Places Initiative at Stantec.
Thanks, Meera. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I've been a certified planner and doing multimodal downtown planning for 25 years, both as a consultant and for municipalities. And, you know, the Urban Places Initiative at Stantec is a good example of where I think the curb is going. You know, this is a cross-cutting thing across a large A&E firm to really begin to get all of our different disciplines thinking more collaboratively about cities and about what happens in downtowns where there's so many different competing users, and obviously the curb being the front door of so many of those competing uses, it winds up being one of the most important places. So my answer to the question is that in the end, that curb is the primary way to make downtowns happen. It is the place of interaction for business, for commerce, for transportation, for restaurants, for getting home. It's all about people and what they want to do. And I think the importance of us managing it is only going to grow increasingly with the introduction of so many additional ways of getting around in the very near autonomous micromobility smart future that's already upon us.
That's great. Thank you, Jason. Well, we're really excited to get started and talk a little bit about sort of what we started to introduce about this idea of the curbs are important. What do we do? So I'll kick us off and then I'll turn it over to each of the panelists to tell a little bit about what we've been working on over the past little bit. So I don't think any of you who are here don't understand the importance of curbs. We obviously, you know, it's quickly emerging as a really important space given all of these different modes that are coming on in cities. We know that some of the traditional street parking, some of the traditional freight spaces are now battling some of these new modes that are coming in, whether they're rideshare, whether they're bikes, any of those things, and it's resulting in some curbside disruption. You've likely seen this in your own hometowns. You're here at this panel, so I'm sure you understand the importance of that. And we're really interested in thinking about how can cities responsibly manage these spaces? How can you balance out these competing objectives of our communities making sure we're addressing our business needs, making sure that we're including local transportation priorities in there, bringing all of that together to develop a solution. As we all came together to start thinking about a solution for this problem, we recognize that cities have multiple paths to manage this, but a key piece that we realize is there's a lot of thinking about how to manage this and developing interventions. But one of the things that we found was missing in all of our conversations, one of the pieces of knowledge was really understanding what that real-time demand was at the curb. And that's sort of where we started our exploration of developing a solution for this. So as we approached it, we wanted to think about what type of information cities would need. And so we started with this problem statement of cities needing better information about curbside activity, value, and context. And once they have that information, being able to use that to better allocate and manage the space with curbside users. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to think about this from a data and modeling approach first. We understand that a real-time intervention does need to happen, and we'll talk about that afterwards, but we really wanted to first start with this data piece of it. So that's where we want to get started, and that's what we're going to talk about the exploration of our project. We, again, thinking about this in two phases, that deployment piece of it, running that dynamically managed parking space, piloting it, thinking about how that scales, that all comes, but we wanted to think about that data and modeling piece first. And so from our project, from this first phase that we've been working on, we wanted to develop a model that can inform that dynamically managed business model using this proportional use and value, thinking about, can we use our data and model to understand what is the current activity? What is the demand? How do those match? Where do those not match? And how can you make adjustments to be able to create efficiencies for curbside users? So with that being sort of the setup, we've been working, so CityTech has been working with Teralytics, Here Technologies, Stantec, and multiple other partners to develop this sort of solution around this. So with that, we want to start with thinking about that role of data around this. What data do you need? How do you use that data? What needs to be pulled into what will inevitably be a model that we will do that will turn into that deployment. And so to start talking about the data, I'm going to turn it over to Anne. Anne, tell me when you want me to cue video or the next slide.
Sure. Okay, so our role in this project was really to help Here and Stantec to understand what total mobility demand was in our analysis area. So really to enable their modeling exercises. And that's really sort of the core of what Teralytics does, is helping our customers understand the current context. Just because really your understanding of the current context can act as the foundation to developing, what solutions or policy interventions, etc. Like without that, it's really difficult to know what solutions might work best. In particular, we found that a lot of the times what we see within a city is not always kind of what we expect. So if you're acting kind of on a gut feeling, but really, when you look at the data, maybe it might not reflect that. So it's great to have data to back up your decisions. So maybe if you cue the video, can you show that now? So this kind of sort of helps to visualize our product. So what we provided to Here in Stantec was an origin destination matrix, and that shows trips to and from and within census tracts by hour and by trip purpose per month. So you'll see here, this is a representation of Zurich, but shows how trip flows start at, I think it was like 5:30 in the morning and goes through rush hour. You see mobility increasing in the morning. This kind of is the foundation of what we do. I think you can go to the next slide now. So maybe to talk a bit about how we get to this point and understanding of how people are moving within a city. So we do this by looking at what we believe to be the most accurate and inclusive indicator of people's mobility, and that's people's mobile devices. Just because if you think about it, a phone is really what everyone has with them at all times for the most part. And our engineers and data scientists have taken this data and kind of sorted through the noisy signal you find in telecom data and developed a methodology for taking this and delivering insights that are accurate and inclusive, showing people's mobility while also protecting people's privacy. What we do here is really catered to the transportation sector. Kind of interpreting mobile signal data kind of requires a really deep understanding of mobility services and how people are traveling within and between places to understand, when is the start of a trip, when is the end of a trip. And we've devised this approach to specifically meet the needs of transport operators. So maybe just the last point is why we thought this data would be so useful in projects like this is when deploying solutions, maybe you can start to see their effect, right? We can see how mobility might be changing over time. Since this data is not static, it changes, we can continuously monitor it and see how our solutions are working. And, kind of like I was saying before, the curb people move the way they do now, and as particular as we've learned throughout this time, this changes and we don't know how mobility will look like in the future. So perhaps using data like this, we can continuously monitor and provide like the best solutions for that given moment.
Awesome, thanks, Anne. And that's a great point at the end about being able to base some of the things that we're doing within the data is really nice, because that does allow us to think about how do we move it to other places, because we are just feeding the data into it. What happens if conditions change? If it's based in these data pieces that we can pull, then we can continue to refine the model based on where we're going. So moving along the data journey, so we have this sort of sense track level data that Anne has shown. Moving on to Gerhard, if you want to talk a little bit about HERE's role in this and how the data that Teralytics and others gave you and HERE's own data worked towards the model.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the additional details. And this was my first time I saw that video. I think it's fascinating to see the traffic. I was just speechless. So our role really was to, like I said earlier, I mean, we're looking at this topic from three angles. One is mobility delivery and then parking itself. And this is where we're trying to understand how do they interconnect, what's our role at HERE Technologies, where we can come in with innovation and work with innovative companies as well. So our team basically created a demand model based on aggregating more granular block by block, link by link data that's more granular than census tract. And then we analyzed traffic and congestion activity in the Chicago metro area generally to identify where the bottlenecks are, where friction points and areas are for specific parking and curbside locations. And then the team dove deeper and looked into this, okay, how do we highlight areas where demand for curbside space is most valuable and creates opportunities to produce, for example, efficiencies where they might exist. And then we looked at our portfolio and said, okay, we have POI data with different focuses, right? And we pulled that out and looked, okay, what's for example, level 1, where it's commercial categories like restaurants. Let's use that and add on top traffic data to aggregate POI density into this model that the team was building. And then during the course of this exercise, the team looked at 3 months worth of rideshare and taxi data that was provided by the city of Chicago on top of that. And then the whole data was sliced and diced basically in 15-minute increments over 24-hour periods. And we looked at HERE GeoJSON. We used GeoJSON files to geolocate the curbside on our map. And based on that, we created that demand model that enabled us to identify a mismatch between curbside activity and demand. And this was just another piece of the puzzle, if you will, that we ended up passing on to Jason, and Jason is going to dive into the modeling and pricing piece as a next step. And I think just that's going to complete pretty much the journey of this phase 1 of the project. So Jason, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Meera, I think you had another poll you wanted to ask everybody at some point in time. We can cue that up maybe.
So we did have another poll. Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we already answered. I think the questions got a little switched. But this one, we all answered what we thought would be the most important reason to flex the curb, but we'd love to hear from all of you.
And while that's going, I can throw in some thoughts, building right off of what Gerhard was just talking about. 25 years ago, I started as a multimodal planner, but 20 years ago, I pretty much started my parking career nonstop. Because in the end, so much of what we were trying to do back then at a municipal level, and then eventually, of course, in consulting even more so, was about multimodal access, and it was the curb where so many of those stories begin, whether that was in the way of a bicycle or blocking somebody crossing on foot, and ultimately with a lot of the additional modes that we are talking about now. And I think truly, as you can see in the results right here on screen, is that the answer is what is the most important reason to flex the curb is all of the above, for sure. Now, I think individual modes at certain locations and other things such as streeteries and parklets are absolutely part of this, but there is a true multimodal dimension to this. And so in our modeling steps, and I'm going to go through 5 steps, the first being here on screen. First of all, let me just put in a plug. The types of information we were dealing with for City Tech here are unbelievable because of partners like Teralytics in here. Everybody should be so blessed to be able to start trying to solve the future of humanity with this type of information. Being able to drill down, and still there's many other questions we have to ask, but being able to use this data and be so much more precise about what we're all talking about is incredibly valuable. But this first step was to try to also understand how accurate we were being, because we did not want to approach things from just the lens of vehicular modes, for instance. We really wanted to try to understand who else was getting to that curb. And there's a reason a couple of our models' inputs are shown there on the right. Depending on the mode that you're in, you don't need a lot of curb space necessarily. But also a bus that may need a ton of curb space moves a lot more people. And in the end, when we're really thinking about person access, that's an important relationship. Similarly, for turnover, these are average numbers that came out at average points in the modeling process. But generally speaking, cars are stored at a curb, but all the other modes of transportation go in and out, and they use it like a terminal, essentially. And so one of the key assumptions that we used right up front, which was to maximize person access, took great advantage of the efficiencies of so many other modes of transportation that docked and left from the curb. And that's an important baseline for understanding how maybe the curb can be managed in the future. So the second modeling step gets into the idea of the efficiency of that curb. And we've all long known that price is probably the primary driver for determining somebody's desire to actually use something, as is true in any commodity. And of course, over the last many years, ever since SF Park became so popularized, the idea of using pricing to manage the curb for cars has certainly been a really essential step. And so we actually looked at the data to try to understand what might be the variety of demand influencers besides just price. And in the end, pricing is still the primary influencer. But what we used for our model is a linear optimization routine that tried to maximize the use of the curb to maximize the number of people. But when people come by so many other modes, we had to understand their desire besides just the car. So if we were to go to, there we go, step 3, the sensitivity to pricing or the price elasticity for so many different trips varies, and it varies across the hours of the day. the price that you may charge at the curb at peak hour, as we learned in Chicago, can sometimes be over $20, and sometimes that very same curb should be zero. And those types of changes across the day are all basic econometric supply and demand curves, as you see there. But when you're starting to vary all these different modes in their variety of demands, we needed to pin something down as the control. And that was maximizing person access. Now, person access varies. So across wherever you are in Chicago or any city, things are going to be different. And thanks to a lot of the inputs, not only from here, but even just looking at parking data. This is a map of parking meter activity in Chicago, understanding rideshare, freight access, etc. We begin to see that the patterns change very radically across the city, even just around the corner from one another. And in the end, step 5, the model that we produced is something that shows this type of variation across the entire city. So if this is a map of the loop of Chicago, which was our focus area, you can see that the highest levels of variation are happening in the more urban core in the northern and northwestern corner of it. And that's an important takeaway to understand, because the curbs of Chicago, at least in the loop, are generally managed similarly. But the activity data says things might want to be different. And it's this type of output that leads us to thinking about where we might do phase 2 proposals for managing the curve. So I get to talk about the fun results of all this. So the model came out with its optimization routine that said, we really need to change the current mix of spaces. Today, this is the by census tract, because we had to run a lot of this stuff at the high-level census tract, and sharing this in the weeds is going to be too confusing. At the high level, there is a lot of space that we have it labeled here as freight, but is basically dedicated to flexible use today. It's loading zones. It may be time-regulated spaces, but it's not priced car parking. And of course, there's transit stops, but there's very little for taxi. I'm not sure if there's any designated rideshare spaces, some on-street bike share divvy spaces, but it's really about the traditional modes of access. When we ran the linear optimization model, we looked at all the folks coming into the city. It definitely said we should be changing the curbs. And what's most interesting about how they should be changing the curbs is looking at everybody's answer to the first polling question of today. We actually slightly increased the amount of parking available. Apologies for construction noise in the background. We actually increased the amount of on-street parking for cars. The biggest user that flexed was freight. We had loading zones that were really not optimized for the amount of use that they were getting. We, of course, were able to add lots of taxi spaces, rideshare spaces, divvy docks, but really in the total sense of curb length for all those other modes, they don't need a lot because they have that high level of turnover. And there's such a latent demand for driving that we actually said there should probably be a little bit more car parking, believe it or not, on street. So that's the allocation. But what does that mean for trips? So our model then said, if we want to get here, we've got to price accordingly. And when we priced accordingly, well, we were able to charge a lot more for the car than we were for other modes, because the car is the thing that's hogging space but has lots of demand. And what is very fascinating is that we, by knowing how many trips are coming in, were able to handle just as much freight, even with a charge, as we were before, or pretty close, with significantly less loading space. So you can see that we have nearly as many freight trips, we have about as many taxi trips, more biking, a little more transit, a noticeable bit more of rideshare, and a significant drop in driving. So in the end, the trip mix pretty much stayed the same, but we've sort of induced mode shift to some degree. Now, we didn't calculate the resulting effect and how many people may have shifted. We suspect a lot of on-street parking demand might go off-street. But what does this mean for the bottom line? One of the key questions was, we want to monetize this, and the pricing at the curb to get the desired outcome is going to do what? Well, on the next slide, you're going to see that it actually produced 50% more revenue for Chicago when focused on multimodal access. This wasn't even a goal of trying to figure out how to make the most money off of the highest payer, which is typically the single occupant vehicle. This was simply a way to say, look, let's get in as many people as possible. We're not even going to charge that much for freight. It's like a $5 20-minute window for primary spaces as an experiment during peak times. A minor percentage of rideshare fees that comes to this, maybe some dedication more at a hypothetical level of a bike access fee to get to the curb. Most of it is borne by automobiles, and there's actually more of those parking spaces. In the end, and you can go ahead to that next slide, Meera. In the end, the key takeaway here is that we're really heavily focused on maximizing person access, and it wound up producing a significant amount of curbside revenue, whether that's used by the city or another agency, whether it's shared for whatever benefits is a separate discussion. But it's simply acknowledging that there's greater efficiencies in more efficient modes, as this graphic from NACTO has been talking about for years. But the second bullet here I think is important. It may be more unique to Chicago, but in most cities I know, there is a lot of loading space. Some older East Coast cities, they don't dedicate as much. Others are more flexible there. And in this classification, loading was a lot of the unpriced market as well. A better management, a better specification of the curb can really produce benefits. In particular, using those spaces for these other modes that have such high demand and can still be a significant chunk of the new revenue, ride share, bike share, ultimately new forms of micromobility. But we do know in the end that better data will still make this greater. As great as it's been to work with Teralytics here and others on this, we know that the more specific we can get, the more direct field observations we can get, the better information about what activity is actually trying to get across the curb, we can optimize this. We can even potentially adjust the goals for what we want to do. And I think it's really an important story here is that while changes across the hours and the days and the seasons of the year for any particular block face may produce different levels of revenue, may produce different outcomes, if we have better information about who needs access and we keep our eye on the goal of that curb serving the business, the park, the museum, the theater, the restaurant behind it, that is ultimately going to be a win-win for everybody. And I think that's a very important high-level takeaway. Now, our next steps in this process are to say, okay, this model at a high level, as we drill down on all this data, is telling us we might use these optimization routines. We should probably go out and pilot this in the field. How? And I think the how is particularly relevant to IPMI members and others here on the line, is what are the things that are gonna make this happen? How can we design a phase 2 pilot that works well? So I think this is sort of like the icebreaker next question. You know, I look at, and I don't know if the next slide, Meera, is this idea or not. I look at the curb as a terminal for all forms of mobility. I look at it not as a place to store cars. As incredibly financially valuable as parking can be, I can accommodate as many parkers, but create the terminals of the future by making the more dynamic areas become terminals. They really should be places that can accommodate all these modes, but there's a lot of technologies that are out there. And so some of our partners are very interested, as I think IPMI members might be as well, in what is the tech that's out there. It's no longer going to be just a pay station. It isn't necessarily going to be just pay by cell. There may need to be some way of telling people, for instance, this rendering just says there's some sort of post with a light that has your number on it. I don't know what that technology may be. Some overseas have had reservation systems. There's pucks in streets. I think the technologies will definitely evolve and are worthy of months, if not years of discussion. But I think as long as we all keep our eye on the ball of recognizing that this dynamic at the curb is a great value for the community, for business, and of course, for all of us consultants who like to talk about it, in the end, it means revenue for the municipalities in which we work.
Great. Thank you, Jason, for taking us through all of the modeling. Jason started to talk a little bit about what next steps for this would look like. We'd like to wrap up the session with just a quick summary of that. As we said, this is sort of the first phase that we're working on. We wanted to make sure we had a really solid data-driven model that we could then, and results that we could then call upon to be able to move forward and see what that deployment looks like. There are a couple of things around it, some that you may be thinking about already. Well, what does parking look like in the Chicago Loop right now? It is, COVID time, people are working from home. There's a lot of that. We think it's a really interesting opportunity. A lot of this was modeled with pre-COVID data to be able to simulate what cities will look like and what cities will come back to looking like eventually. And so we want to be able to use this as an opportunity to understand how we can set up the best systems to be able to move forward into this reopening that we will have. But there is still additional data that we need, right? Of course, we need to think about the data as and Jason had mentioned this at the beginning, and I think Ann and Gerhard as well, as we start to think about what deployment of this looks like, we want to make sure that we're actually doing some ground truthing when we're out there, right? When we have this going on, is this actually how it's supposed to work? Does this serve what's on the other side of the curve appropriately? We're modeling it. We want to make sure that it actually makes sense for the people who are using it. As Jason mentioned, what sort of technology do you need to be able to enable it, to enforce it? There's a big enforcement question on this, especially as we're thinking about some of these things like loading zones that are maybe just flexible spots right now that aren't necessarily being that enforced. How do we enforce it if we're transferring them or changing around? And how can we create better solutions using all of those things? We also want to consider, as Jason said, what other elements that we need to include on that curb. We have considered a lot of the different modes that are being used right now, but what else do we need to be thinking about? And then one thing that we didn't talk about was thinking about how can we utilize, we didn't talk much about, I think a couple of you brought it up, is how can we utilize both on and off street options to be able to optimize and increase the efficiency. So talking a lot about how do we change what's on the curb. The curb is obviously our focus, but there's a lot of off street as well. Is there an option? We started looking at this for our project, taking some data from off street as well to think about, is there a way to optimize this by moving some of that demand on street to off street, or moving something else off street to create the appropriate space on street? And that is also another piece of it that makes it complex, but is really interesting to see how you can blend some of those things. So with that, I would love, Kim, if we could do the final polling question. And then Jason, Ann, and Gerhard, if there's anything else you would like to add at the end. Otherwise, I think we are good to move on to Q&A after this polling question.
I mean, just from a here perspective or from a product perspective, and then when I'm looking at parking, right, we're looking at, as I said, at the three big components like mobility, delivery, and parking. But then for us, parking is an end-to-end challenge that we're trying to fix together with our customers. And our customers are automotive OEMs, right? And ultimately, it is you and I driving a car. But for us, it's combining on-street and off-street and creating that seamless experience That's what we're trying to solve for. And having visibility into these incredibly innovative use cases where we can extract a lot of value from understanding, resulting in us understanding what happens to the curb in particular, is extremely valuable for the entire solution that we're building at Here Technologies, right? So it's a piece of the puzzle, of this highly complex puzzle that Jason alluded to, right? It takes many years of one's life to just be engaged and involved in this product, and still we're making progress, but we're not there yet. So this is what I find fascinating, to be part of this project, because it helps us educate our customers ultimately as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as you alluded to, it's definitely ever changing. It's a start. It is not everything, and it's part of the reason we wanted to think about how to set this up appropriately, in a way that it works for current times. It works for the current space. We want to think about, how do you scale this, whether up or down, right? Like whether it's scaling across Chicago, which is what we used as a test bed, to other cities, whether smaller or bigger, that have different requirements. How can you take this as a model and then be able to share it with other cities, other locations, to be able to make this a sustainable way to think about how to approach this?
Yeah, absolutely.
I see that slightly ahead in this poll, in all of your opinions of what's the most important thing that needs to be done to successfully roll this out, is to create a merchant education program to help the businesses understand the changes. And that is absolutely a really, really great point. There's an enforcement piece and there's an education piece that are really important to this. As we go through, we need to make sure people understand what the changes are, when they're going to be changing, especially if we start thinking about this more dynamically. We've sort of talked a little bit about how things can change, but how much can we start incorporating real-time demand and make changes at different times of the day? And if merchants don't understand what's happening, if people who are using it don't understand what's happening, it's just going to be chaos, and we don't want that. So
I wanted to throw in on that, Meera, though. It's kind of funny. I think of all the survey potential answers that we had offered up, they're all relatively easy to solve in the linear mindset. I can figure out a way to enforce, I can figure out a way to sign, but how do you deal with merchants? And I've been doing parking studies across North America now. I've probably worked in over 100 places to do parking. And what I've always heard is the merchants are going to hate any changes. They're going to hate any pricing that's involved. But what's fascinating is that in easily half of those, they needed to introduce new pricing. And by the end of the study, it was the merchants who understood why. Because in the end, it's all about getting customers to their businesses. There's a fear of that, but when the curb opens up, they're usually the number one ralliers. In a couple places I can think of, introduced parking pricing for the first time in 50 years since after they pulled out the meters. It was the merchants who came to the city council meeting to get the plan passed. So, in a place that's already got parking pricing like Chicago, we're taking it to the next step. We're talking about what that curb can be in so much more, in so many other ways. But in the end, it's still about customer and other access of essential goods or needs. And that in the end is something that speaks very well to merchants. But yes, they still need to hear that, and they need to be brought along.
No, absolutely. That's a really great point. I'm curious what the two people who answered other are, what they think should be done, but I don't think there's a space to answer, but we can guess. It looks like technology. People definitely thought technology and street signage. This idea of just being able to, a lot of these, the common theme across these is making sure there's information out there, there's education, and there's sort of easy utilization of what we're planning to do. So great, Kim, if it makes sense for us to kick off Q&A at this point. I know we just have 15 minutes left.
Absolutely. So the first question came in fairly early, Meera. It was, how can person access take into account building access needs, such as loading, PUDO, solid waste pickup, mail delivery, etc.?
It's a great question. I'll actually turn over to Jason. I see you unmuting if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think we tried our best to model mobile access to the curb, more or less, and what is known. And honestly, there's not a ton of great data about freight. It's, model level freight. We had a partner on the team, Carrie Direct, doing some great interviews with local shippers to understand, and particularly the shift to the gig economy has got a lot of local shipments being handled by mom and pops with their own truck, and they're extremely sensitive to paying a parking ticket, much less negotiating thousands of them a year like FedEx or UPS might do with municipalities. So they are all about a service charge to get to the curb, because they know that they could get in, and if they had that curb for 20 minutes at only $5 in the loop, they could make 20 deliveries. And so that type of additional change is important to understand. There's all sorts of other pickup drop-off needs that are happening. Cars, just you and I need to get in and out of the curb. So we still need to preserve space for that type of activity, fire activity, emergency service activity. So there's more dynamic than is just shown here. And I think in any scenario, you'd reserve sort of space and accommodation for that. I think what we concluded, though, is in Chicago, a lot of those needs had reserved too much space over time. And that if we could manage all of that space more efficiently and provide another half of it for all these other modes, they didn't need a lot. But once they got it, access improved significantly.
Thanks, Jason. Sorry, one thing I just want to add to that, Jason alluded to it. Along with this data piece that we presented today, there were other parts of it that we were looking at just for time constraints. We didn't present everything that we've done in the first phase, but one of the things that we did was try to get a better freight perspective. And we did interview, through Carrier Direct, interview some of the freight companies around what their needs are as well, to make sure that, as we're talking about pulling back loading spaces, that it still sort of made sense and it aligned with some of their needs as well.
Great, thank you. I think this one was for Jason. How do you obtain your data to build the activity models?
I think that's actually a little bit more for the folks at Teralytics and here. I will say that, we did also look at standard census data, American flow data, to sort of understand what was happening at the census tract level, just to sort of back check and make sure and try to be as multimodal as possible. But, truly it comes down to here showing us all of that activity at the curb and Teralytics by all the flow movements into which parts of the downtown that were the most valuable. And before Gerhard or Ann want to throw in, I will say you can get a lot of location-based data in any market around North America. So a lot of what we've done here, we can do elsewhere. In fact, Stantec's done a small version of this not too long ago in Tampa, and we're starting to take a look at it in a couple other metro areas. So it's definitely out there.
Just maybe to provide more color. So as I said earlier, I mean, we have access to like our own database of like POI data, for example, traffic data that we're collecting from our owners. So here Technologies is owned by a conglomerate or consortium of 3 major OEMs, Audi, BMW, and Daimler. And now Mitsubishi also has become one of the investors. So that sensor data we have access to, traffic data, traffic information, real-time data. We have historical database, of course, as well. So, and then if you look at the POI database, we have different layers of depth, if you will, right? So you have commercial categories, but you can go as deep as you want to slice and dice this POI data set that we have. So I think where I'm also personally getting excited about the next stages is around what else can we provide to dive really deeper here, because we have real-time data, we have that capability that we were happy to explore, and it's, I think solving this problem will require an open mindset, will require data sharing with all entities involved, really. that's why we're excited to be part of this project, because CityTech has been extremely supportive in putting all these building blocks together and driving this forward. But ultimately, we are not the experts, right? We're a mapping company, and that's what we've been doing for 30 years. We're looking at innovation to trying to add value to additional solutions. We're looking at people in the space to help us also understand how can we build additional solutions and capabilities based on what we already have available, and then what else are we maybe missing, right? So for us, it's a two-way street, really.
Maybe also to just add something. I think when we started this project, we weren't creating a solution just for Chicago, right? We were trying to create something that we could scale to other cities in the US, maybe elsewhere. And that's why I think kind of the team we put together, this is data that's not just specific to Chicago necessarily, but you can get that for other cities as well. So hopefully this type of thinking and solution modeling can apply to other places.
Thank you. How does off-street parking tie into the understanding of the curb? Is there opportunity for public-private partnership? A number of cities are working to reduce off-street parking requirements in construction, but I wonder if off-street was folded into the planning for the curb, we could significantly increase the impact of the work being done to maximize the curb benefits.
I want to jump in on this one because I love this question. It's part of what has always sort of motivated me to understand the curb. I worked not that long ago on a major development, and they really embraced the idea of curbside access. And it theoretically, at least for them, significantly slashed the amount of off-street parking that was required. But they were looking at a future where there was going to be a lot of mode shift, where there was going to be a lot of shared mobility. And the reality is that people are still driving a lot. Rates are changing, but it's definitely an evolving dynamic that will take some time. And we're not all going to be on shared mobility with mobility as a service and robot taxis anytime soon, but it will come. One of the key benefits in theory, and part of our modeling, is to actually talk about all the other potential forms of monetization, which are not the direct curb access, which are the indirect. And so indirectly, we even tried to model streeteries, which are actually kind of hard to put on the linear optimization model because you don't know which restaurant would actually use a streetery, for instance. Only so many of them would want it. Only so many of them would pay for that. So we had to take that out of the direct financial model and do a little bit more high-level estimation on what a streetery might mean, or a parklet or outdoor dining. And then the other part of that other form of revenue is what is the savings for a land developer who, for instance, had planned on a tower and they needed a lot of pickup and drop off anyways, because maybe they were medical. Now, if we're turning the entire curb into their pickup and drop off zone, they can use that private land for something else. So there's the higher and better use of off-street, and then as well as maybe the declining demand of off-street. But I guess I'll end on where I started, when I had assumed that we would be shifting lots of off-street away. The reality, at least in Chicago, and I'm sure this is in other cities, is the amount of vehicle trips into the loop enormously outnumbers the amount of on-street parking. The maximum supply you could ever get for the car is maybe 5,000 spaces in the loop. Only 2,500 of them are today for on-street metered parking. There's tens of thousands of cars pouring in just the peak hour that are accommodated by tens of thousands of off-street parking spaces today. So it is still in the mix, hopefully declining over time due to its great cost.
Adding a little bit to a couple of Jason's points and answering this question a little bit indirectly too. A couple of the things that we're thinking about with the off-street. So from City Tech's perspective, we are working on separate projects with, so in Chicago, there's a number of parking garages, and we have a really big underground parking garage structure as well through our Millennium Garages. And we're thinking about if you transfer things like freight to something like that, how does that clear up spaces? Can you have freight hubs in these underground garages? How can you interface with them? It's not exactly around the new construction, but generally thinking about how do you interface with some of these garages. And we're both thinking about what those partnerships would look like, and also we're thinking about how to actually just tactically make those moves. Like, how do you tell people, you know what, it's a little busy here, but if you go to this garage, you can park here. It'll be a reduced rate or whatever it is. How do you build those partnerships, and how do you have whether it's the technology or the signage or the wayfinding or whatever you need to actually be able to get people or things or whatever to the place that they should be going at that time. And so that's something we're really interested in thinking about, is how to better direct that once we have an answer to it.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions. Love this modeling. My question is how to scale it down to fit smaller urban districts.
I'll say fast, and I'm sure here in Teralytics will weigh in. This data is everywhere. So as long as you have a congested, even if it's a 2-block district in a small community, these very same principles apply. And this type of data can help inform those decisions. Yeah, you can't micromanage this curb with everything else being free and wide open. Everybody will just leave it. But in a average downtown where you have a quote parking problem, that is absolutely an opportunity.
Yeah, I wonder what the pain point really is in smaller areas, right? And I would like to look at that data, right? Because I know the city of Seattle is very, very active in this space with flex curb and all that good stuff. Chicago, obviously. I mean, there are the usual suspects like the top 5 cities in the US. And then I would also like to see something similar in Europe, right? Or on APAC to understand a different color of the same problem, if you're a different shade of the same problem, see how this model could actually be leveraged in other environments and use cases as well. So that's, given the fact that we have this experience, it's something that we can transfer, and it's just a matter of the input in the data and see then to measure, is that really a pain point? Or do we just want it to be a pain point in the smaller areas? Right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't have the answer, but I think we need to look at the data to Meera's point, right?
Absolutely. To echo those things, I think our goal was to be able to set up data sources and a framework that could be transferred. But this idea of all cities are different, and we do need to understand what the unique concerns are in that city, and then be able to, this is a great starting point, but then be able to think about how do we adjust that model to the problem that we're actually solving.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. We have 2 more questions that I'm going to combine just because we're short on time. What parking demand generator will take the biggest hit post-pandemic? And is this study written up anywhere?
In terms of being written up anywhere, we'll definitely have it on our website as a case study, and then we're working with the team to figure out how to best disseminate some of the results that we've come on. As we mentioned, we're thinking about how this goes on to the next phase as well, and so there's this idea of do we present this now? Do we combine everything and have a full solution? So we're still working on it, but at least it will definitely be on the City Tech website, I can say.
And I would guess that technically speaking, the other half of the question is anybody's best guess. Truth is, as cities are starting to sort of come back to normal, I'm seeing the same problems and the same data. The intensity is not there yet, but the same traffic is growing. I think the belief that everybody's just going to suddenly magically work from home is not there. Even if it was a huge percentage of people, the curbside demand in Chicago is a fraction of the total trips coming into Chicago. people will always want to come to the front door if they can. So I think this type of solution will always apply regardless of what modes we use.
Agreed. I mean, we see, interestingly enough, if I'm looking at, and I'm in constant touch with our traffic folks, for example, just as a data point maybe, and to Jason's point, we see that there's, the pattern is repeating itself, basically, where we were pre-pandemic, we're pretty much there again during pandemic, and potentially we might be even higher post-pandemic, as people are probably even more concerned about using public transportation of whatever kind. So I think this issue is probably going to be even more amplified.
Just to also echo everyone's thoughts, a lot of the transport operators and planners we work with are asking the same question, and really the answer is always, as Jason said, we don't know yet. But I think that's why looking at this type of data is so important, and this continuous monitoring is because it could be different in different cities. It could change over time. I mean, we internally look at the mobility data across countries and cities, and even like reactions to lockdowns and quarantine measures have vastly been different across cities and countries. So it's impossible for us to guess right now just what even going back to normality might look like and how that would affect mobility demand.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks for being with us. We really do appreciate it. It was a great session. I learned a lot. Everyone, we are all heading into our closing panel. You'll find the link in your digital program guide. It is inspiration and innovation from every corner of the parking, transportation, and mobility industry. And we will see you there. Thanks for being with us, and thanks so much for our panelists.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.